Consider a photograph, a simple black and white image captured in the year 1939. 7 men. They stand in a rigid line, shoulder to shoulder, before a modest wooden house. Each holds a rifle, muzzles pointed to the earth, but their grip is firm, almost military in its precision. Their clothing is simple, functional, the attire of hunters or lumberjacks, perhaps even a local militia. Their faces seem chiseled from stone, calm, severe, impenetrable. It is the stoic gaze so often found in pre-war portraits, the look of men who understand the cost of life and, perhaps, of death. At first glance, it is unremarkable, a group portrait from a bygone era. But what if it is not a portrait? What if, within this frozen frame, in the interplay of light and shadow, in the dead sheen of their eyes, a confession to a monstrous crime lies encoded? For 80 years, the image held its silence. But when technology finally allowed us to truly see inside it, the truth it guarded proved more terrifying than any speculation. This is the story of how a single photograph can shatter the silence of an entire town and compel the ghosts of the past to speak. It began where history often goes to die, in a dusty auxiliary archive at a Pennsylvania university. On a bleak afternoon, Dr. Olivia Harper, a historian specializing in the Great Depression, was sifting through old collections. Her work was routine, sourcing photographs of the Civilian Conservation Corps for a secondary project. She moved through the folders, inhaling the scent of old paper and binder's glue, until her gaze fell upon a plain cardboard box wedged in a corner beneath stacks of yellowed case files. On a faded label, just 2 words and a date were scrawled by hand. Oak Ridge, 1939, personal. Something about that word personal gave her pause. Archives are hostile to the personal. They crave facts, protocols, official reports. Consumed by curiosity, Olivia carefully opened the brittle carton. Inside, dozens of photographs lay scattered. Most were mundane scenes: a sawmill, road construction, a town festival. But one made her heart skip a beat. It was the image of the 7 men with their rifles. The print quality was astonishing for its time. Every contour, every fold of cloth, every scratch on a rifle stock was rendered in sharp relief. And as a professional, Olivia knew instantly something was wrong. Something was deeply, fundamentally wrong. The composition was too perfect, its symmetry unsettling, as if framed not by a photographer, but by an artist obsessed with a grim and absolute order. The shadows fell unnaturally, accentuating the angularity of the men's faces and the profound emptiness in their eyes. This was not a record of a moment. It was a declaration, etched in silver and silence, waiting for someone to finally learn its language. In their eyes, there was no hunter's pride, no laborer's weariness. There was only a cold, vacant finality. Then she began to see the details, the small inconsistencies that would escape the casual observer. The backdrop behind the men, a dense forest, was strangely blurred, as if the photographer had employed a technique not yet common for the era. And there, in the upper left corner, nestled among the pine branches, was a tiny, smeared blemish. It was as if a hand had reached into the past, attempting to scrape the very emulsion from the negative, to erase something, or someone, from the photograph forever. On the reverse, there were no names, no inscriptions. Only the same 2 words, penciled in a spare, deliberate hand that had been on the box. Oak Ridge, 1939. The questions began to spiral. Who were these men? Why were they armed in a time of peace?
If you think you've seen everything, wait. What comes next will turn everything upside down.
A simple hunting club? But where were the smiles, the sense of camaraderie? This, the forest at their backs, was no mere backdrop, but a silent accomplice, a witness to something hidden deep within its boughs. Without a second thought, Olivia captured the image with her phone and sent it to her colleague, Lucas. He was her complete opposite. Where she worked with paper and dust, his elements were pixels and algorithms. A genius of digital forensics and a historian of photography, he could make old images speak, forcing them to tell the stories their creators had tried to silence. Her message was brief. "Look at this. Something is wrong with it. Enlarge." While she waited for his reply, Olivia immersed herself in the history of Oak Ridge itself. A small town, lost in the forests of northern Pennsylvania, the official archives held surprisingly little. Founded in the mid-19th century as a logging settlement, it had enjoyed a brief boom during the Great Depression, only to fade quietly back into one of 1,000 forgotten dots on a map. But the local newspapers, preserved on brittle microfilm, hinted at something darker. In the issues from the late 1930s, Olivia found several strange notations. One, from 1938, made a passing mention of a family that had vanished from the edge of town. They were simply gone. No investigation, no search parties. Another article spoke of civil unrest, but the phrasing was unnervingly vague. A brief but regrettable conflict occurred in the North Woods. No names, no dates, no details. It was as if the editor feared writing a single word too many. And then she found the obituaries. A series of them, published over a 6-month period in 1939. All young men, between the ages of 20 and 30. The causes of death were suspiciously uniform. Accident, a hunting mishap, exposure. Too many, too frequent, too neat. Something had happened in Oak Ridge 80 years ago. Something vast and terrible. And someone had worked tirelessly to ensure that of this event, nothing would remain but the faintest of whispers, the quietest of echoes, and a single haunting photograph. The reports were evasive. The dry archives had given all they could. Olivia understood she had reached the end of the paper trail. What she needed now were living voices, a living memory. She began to call local historians, librarians. She even tracked down the number of an elderly former mayor of Oak Ridge. The reaction was almost uniform. Most refused to speak. One whispered into the receiver, "That was a time people don't talk about," before the line went dead. Another hung up the moment she uttered the year 1939. The town was keeping its secret, not with newspaper headlines, but with a deafening, unified silence. Hope arrived from an unexpected quarter. In Pittsburgh, she located a retired postman who had lived in Oak Ridge as a young man. After a long pause, he finally spoke. "There was a group of men back then," he began, his words slow, carefully chosen. "They weren't the law, but they acted as if they were. They had their own code, thought they were doing the town a service." He paused. And then, after one summer, they were just never mentioned again. Not at all. Olivia looked again at the photograph on her phone. The forest clearing where the 7 men stood, judgment of retribution. The date, the expressions, the absence of names. These men weren't posing for posterity. They were fixing a moment in time. The moment something irreversible was done. Lucas's laboratory smelled of ozone, coffee, and hot solder. It was his sanctuary, a temple of technology where he resurrected dead images. By the time Olivia arrived, he had already run the Oak Ridge photograph through several layers of digital processing. "I think you were right," he said, his eyes fixed on the screen. "This thing was tampered with, intentionally." On the massive monitor before them hung the same image, but now it was alive with previously invisible detail. The men's boots were scuffed and worn.
Most people stop watching right here, but if you continue, you'll discover something almost no one knows.
Their jackets, faded by sun and rain, bore hastily sewn patches. A thin scar traced one man's cheek. The fingers of another were stained with something dark. Ink, perhaps, or gunpowder. "I cleaned up the artifacts in the upper left corner," Lucas said, clicking a few keys. "Someone tried to physically scrape part of the emulsion off the print before it was archived, but modern algorithms can rebuild much of what was hidden." On the screen, where a murky smudge had been, a figure began to emerge, a phantom silhouette, an eighth man, standing just behind the group, half obscured by pine branches. His face had been deliberately mutilated in the image, but what remained was enough to see. This man was not smiling. He was younger than the others, and he was unarmed. History, it seems, does not bury its dead. It merely hides the bodies, waiting for a new light to reveal where the bones lie. His posture spoke of a man who was not there by choice. Perhaps his hands were bound. Then the image analyst magnified the forearm of the man at the far left, emerging from a rolled-up sleeve. There, etched into the skin, was a barely discernible tattoo. A row of faded digits, 748521. For the historian, the air seemed to vanish from the room. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, summoning a ghost from the archives, a once classified file. The Federal Bureau of Investigation's fugitive list for the year 1940. She fed the number into the search field, and a name stared back. 748521, Harold Denton, fugitive from justice. Last seen, Oak Ridge, Pennsylvania, 1939. Suspected of vigilante activities. The photograph was no longer a portrait. It was a silent confession, and perhaps a warning. A wanted man standing shoulder to shoulder with self-proclaimed guardians of the law. But in their rough justice, how much was order and how much was chaos? And could he ever truly be trusted by his new comrades? Now they had faces and a single name. The most painstaking work had just begun. For days on end, facial markers from the enhanced photograph were fed into the hungry maw of recognition software, cross-referencing vast databases of government archives, declassified bureau files, even registries from the Second World War. Meanwhile, another researcher descended into a different kind of darkness. The brittle pages of state police bulletins, the chilling records of long-shuttered asylums.
This is where things get really interesting. What you're about to hear might explain why this was never meant to be discovered.
Correctional colonies and morgues. It was a police booking photo from 1941, buried in a forgotten Department of Justice file that fractured the silence. Walter Red Haley, a former bootlegger reborn as an enforcer. There he was, fifth from the left in the Oak Ridge photograph. The same high cheekbones, the same brutally broken nose. With one man named the Oije, men who, in the desperate twilight of the Great Depression, had decided to forge their own brand of justice. Their group was tied to a string of beatings and disappearances, to the silencing of journalists who dug too deep into the town's secrets. Not one charge had ever made it to a court of law. But the final, most chilling revelation was yet to come. The tallest man, standing at the far right, was identified as Emery Beckett, the local judge. A man whose public record was immaculate. But whispers from the Depression era told a different story, of secret tribunals, of sentences passed down in shadow without jury or appeal. His presence changed everything. This was not a mere posse of embittered men. This was the establishment. Men who held the power to define justice itself, even if its defense required the spilling of blood. A question lingered, as stark as the photograph itself. What became of these men after this moment was frozen in time? Did they commit an act so terrible they were deliberately erased from the town's memory? The answer lay not in a criminal file, but in another dusty box in the Oak Ridge County Archives. The label was simple, innocuous. Flood Reports, the 1940s. History is not always written in ink. Sometimes it is written in water. An entire town's dark chapter, its secret tribunals and its rough justice, seemingly washed clean. Erased not by conspiracy or the slow decay of time, but by the indifferent power of the earth itself, leaving only the question of whether it was a random act of nature or a final, terrible judgment. But what lay within was not a report. It was a coroner's journal, a ledger that had, for reasons unknown, never entered the state's official archives. Among the neat cursive detailing, accidental drownings, and deaths from influenza, Olivia found several pages that sent a chill through her bones. They documented the discovery of 11 bodies, discarded in a ravine not far from Oak Ridge. The date? November 1939. 9 men, 1 woman, 1 child. The cause of death was listed as gunshot wounds and blunt force trauma. Race, not an A. Ethnicity, not registered. There was no record of a police investigation, no public obituaries, only a short, dismissive addendum in pencil. Vagrants, not from our county. Case closed. Olivia began to dig deeper, chasing rumors and the frayed threads of oral tradition. She stumbled upon mentions of a Depression-era commune of freedmen, a place where the families of former slaves and their descendants had settled on forgotten farmland. The community was peaceful, self-sufficient, and for a time tolerated. But as land disputes mounted and racial hostility festered, tensions with neighboring Oak Ridge began to boil. Her search led her to the descendants of a local reporter, Harriet Lomax, who had written 3 unpublished articles in those years about disturbances near the commune. The family still possessed a draft, its title stark and ominous: The Midnight Riders Raid Ridge Hollow. The description of the terrain matched precisely the location where the bodies had been found. These people had not simply been killed, they had been purged. The men in the photograph, they were the executioners. A cold shock seized Olivia. This wasn't just...
And now comes the part no one talks about. But this is where the real mystery begins.
the concealment of a crime, it was the erasure of an existence. An entire community annihilated, its memory systematically buried, while its murderers posed for a photograph, proud of their work. And no one had ever answered for it. The moment Olivia began to share her findings with a small circle of colleagues, the resistance began. At first it was subtle. A letter appeared in her university office bearing no return address, its message typed on an old manual machine. The text was brief. Some ghosts are best left in their graves. Stop digging. Then came the digital assault. Her research folders on the university server were inexplicably corrupted. Her credentials for state archives were suddenly revoked. Her colleague, Lucas, discovered their shared cloud storage had been breached from an unknown IP address, one that traced directly back to Oak Ridge. Soon it became terrifyingly real. The brake line on Lucas's car was severed. The mechanic was certain it was no accident. Finally, the pressure became official. The university dean received a series of formal complaints from the descendants of the men in the photograph. Some truths do not fade with time. They lie in wait, buried under the weight of decades, demanding a voice. They prove that the past is never truly past. It is a living wound, and its silence is often the most damning confession of all. Olivia was denounced, accused of academic malpractice, of twisting conspiracy into a tool for personal gain. Among her detractors, a powerful voice, Senator Thorstad. In a private conversation, a threat was delivered. The university's archival program would lose its funding unless this line of inquiry was buried. The reason for his vehemence would soon become clear. One of the men in the photograph was his grandfather. If this story were to surface, a promising political career would be forever stained by the crimes of an ancestor. But Olivia would not be deterred. With her colleague Lucas, she returned to the photograph, scouring it for what they had missed. And it was Lucas who saw it. A detail nearly invisible in the lower right corner. A scattering of pine needles on the forest floor. Their arrangement felt wrong, unnatural, too orderly. He isolated the fragment, approaching it not as an image, but as a rebus. It was a cipher, part alphanumeric, part rooted in the obscure language of military semaphore. After hours of painstaking work, the code yielded its secrets. It pointed to a location, Ridge Hollow, the site of a former commune, and to something designated only as Vault 18. Suddenly, this was no longer a matter of historical record. It was a search for physical proof, and someone was willing to kill to ensure it was never found. Armed with nothing but the decrypted code and a rising sense of dread, Olivia and Lucas drove toward Ridge Hollow under the cover of twilight. The forest, left to itself for 80 years, had turned wild, reclaiming the old paths almost entirely. With only flashlights, maps, and a small drone for guidance, they pushed deeper into the thicket. Every footstep was an echo of cracking twigs and rustling leaves. Soon, the vestiges of the commune began to appear. Stone foundations swallowed by ivy, a rusted lantern
Welcome to my channel. If you're fascinated by
hanging from a tree branch, a child's boot half consumed by the earth. And then they found it. A hatch concealed beneath the debris of a collapsed barn. Its hinges were rusted solid. It took a crowbar and all of Lucas's strength. With a groan of tortured metal, the hatch gave way, revealing a steep, rotting staircase descending into absolute blackness. What they entered was not a cellar. It was a secret archive. Vault 18. Metal filing cabinets stood in silent rows, scrolls sealed with wax, dozens of boxes filled with letters, photographs, personal effects, and the most damning discovery of all, a diary kept by one of the commune's residents. It chronicled the escalating threats from the townspeople of Oak Ridge. The final entry was penned in a trembling hand. "They will come tomorrow. I can already hear the dogs." The people of Ridge Hollow had beats. They had simply vanished from history. But before Olivia and Lucas could retreat, the beam of Olivia's flashlight caught a flicker of movement, the glint of metal in the trees, the lens of a camera. And then a quiet voice emerged from the darkness. You can't release this. Olivia froze. History is not a static record etched in stone. It is a living thing, buried in the earth, breathing in the dark. It can be suppressed, denied, hidden beneath the debris of generations, but it cannot be killed. And sometimes, all it takes is a single misplaced clue for the ghosts of the past to rise and demand a reckoning from the present. Fear coiled around her, yet she refused to let it show. Beside her, Lucas drew a slow, deliberate breath. "You want us to see you?" he shouted into the oppressive dark. Her voice answered, disembodied and cold. "If you make this public, the community will be harmed." Olivia's voice cut back, sharp as shattered glass. "The way the people in Ridge Hollow were harmed?" "Those people committed a crime," the voice insisted. "They deserved their punishment, even after 80 years. "They were punished," the voice continued. "They were exiled. Oak Ridge did not forgive them." "And now," Lucas added, his tone unyielding, "it won't forget them. Come out into the light." But the only reply was the faint rustle of retreating footsteps. Whoever it was, they were gone. Shaken, but with their resolve hardened into steel, Olivia and Lucas returned to their office that night. They now knew with absolute certainty that they could not remain silent, even if they wanted to. Someone was desperate to preserve the peace of Oak Ridge, a peace built upon the erasure of a horrific crime, and with it, the very existence of a community annihilated by men seeking an outlet for their hatred. But there could be no peace built on such a foundation. The next day, the story ran in the local paper. For the town of Oak Ridge, the revelation was a seismic shock. To learn that their own townspeople, including a fugitive and a sitting judge, had committed such atrocities in the name of supremacy, so close to home. Few remembered the faces in the photograph. Even fewer had ever heard of the commune in Ridge Hollow. But the town's elders still told fragmented stories, whispers of a patrol gang with shotguns who inspired a quiet terror, and of their sudden, unexplained disappearance from town. Now the reason for that disappearance was known to all, and it was horrifying. Months passed. Oak Ridge remained a town divided, but the slow, painful process of healing had begun. Memorials were erected to honor the victims of Ridge Hollow. Discussions of reparations were started. Nothing could bring back the 11 souls lost, but thanks to Olivia and Lucas, they would never again be forgotten. The photograph that started it all now hangs in a museum, a silent witness to a buried truth. 7 murderers and their 8th, almost invisible victim, captured in a frozen moment. Staring at it, one cannot help but wonder haugographs and dusty archives. How many ghosts are simply waiting for the focus to shift, to bring their truth out of the blur and into the light?